The Native American Indian culture fascinates me. It has for most of my life. You probably get an idea of that if you've looked through any of my historic videos and videos about prehistoric Michigan. The Iroquois, however, of the East Coast, probably fascinate me the most because of their high degree of civilization that they reached when all these different groups banded together and became one. And there's a legend about how this happened. It's the Peacemaker and the Tree of Peace, an Iroquois legend. By the way, the Iroquois, while they were out on the East Coast, they also had interplay with Indians here in Native Americans here in Michigan. If you look at my video, The Battle for Skull Island, you'll see that they were treacherous in a sense, and that they came here to Michigan and were part of a battle to exterminate, I believe it was the Sacs, and because they were afraid of them becoming a force against them, that the Sacs might have expanded eastward and disrupted some of their way of life. But the thing that really interests me about this legend is some of the similarities between it and events in the Bible. In John 10:16, Jesus speaks about his other sheep that he had to go to. I've heard said by fundamental preachers that he was talking about people who had died and had not had a chance to hear the word and then and be saved, and that he was going to them in the grave to offer them the chance of salvation. I, on the other hand, can also see where his other sheep may have been in the New World, people that didn't have a chance. So I'm gonna read this legend to you, but I'm gonna give a running commentary as I read it. It begins, the story of the Peacemaker and the Tree of Peace as we know it today originated in the time of terrible conflict. It was a time when people forgot to be thankful, and a time when almost all the people had strayed from the Creator. This is the dark period and perhaps the most violent time of our history, speaking of the Iroquois. Once again, discontentment settled in our people, and bloody wars took place in every village. It sounds not unlike the world as it was in the days of Noah's flood. Noah's flood happened. Why? Because the world was rampant with sin, unimaginable sin. Well, imaginable to the hearts of man, which is evil above all things. But what this legend says sounds a little bit like what the world was like then. To continue, a vicious cycle of war and revenge was running out of control among the 5 nations. The 5 nations that would make up the Iroquois confederacy later. It was amidst all of this chaos that the Creator sent a messenger of peace to be born amongst his people. The traditional Haudenosaunee people consider his actual name to be sacred and therefore never use it. He was called simply the Peacemaker. His mission was to restore love, peace, and harmony back to the people. And to do this, he proposed a set of laws which the people of the nations could live in peace and unity by. And it was a system of self-rule and was guided by moral principles called the Great Law of Peace. It would be interesting to know what time period this was actually supposed to have taken place in, because you can see this as being the Peacemaker is almost a Christ-like figure. He was sent by the Creator, or the Great Spirit, or God, to the Native Americans. He was sent with a message of peace, just as Jesus was sent with a message of peace. But I can't say that this is definitely him. I'm just saying it's an interesting concept, and it would be interesting to know the time period that this took place in to see if it was in the same time frame as when Jesus was crucified, and when he went to be with his other sheep. Now this is interesting. The Peacemaker was born a Huron to a young virgin woman who had not yet gone through her puberty rites. The young woman had not reached her time for the ceremony when she became pregnant. Her mother was worried of what the people of the village would say, so she hid her away during her pregnancy until she gave birth. And she convinced her daughter that they had to get rid of the baby. And the grandmother tried 3 times to kill that baby and failed each time. She then realized that he must be someone special with special powers, and knew that they should raise him carefully. So he was born of a virgin. Now, my son Dennis we were talking about this the other day on the phone, and he brought up to me that, that a lot of cultures have the legend of the virgin birth as part of their religion. The thing is, Satan is not stupid, not totally. And I think he knows part of what God's plan was. And so he could plant these ideas in other cultures to demean and take away from the place that it actually did happen, that a virgin actually did give birth, and that was in Bethlehem of Judea. The only one that actually did. But Satan saw that, assumed that this is what God was going to do, and he did what he could to tear that apart and demean it. Like Herod was having the babies killed, the grandmother in this paragraph could be a type of Herod. But she didn't go out and try to kill all the babies. She just tried to kill the peacemaker, the baby that would become the peacemaker. But she failed. Continuing, as he got older, it was realized that he had great powers of persuasion and a good mind. When he reached manhood, it was time for him to leave on his mission to restore peace and unity to the warring villages to the east. He built a canoe of white stone and set out on his journey to establish a great peace. All the people of the village gathered to see him off and were amazed at the sight because they had never seen a stone float before. But his boat was made of white stone, and they noticed how swift that canoe was moving as it disappeared into the distance, and we are told that this event took place on the northern shores of Lake Ontario. Another parallel with Jesus. Jesus' ministry began, I believe he was in his early 30s. I don't know if it was 31, 32, or 33, I don't know. But his ministry to come and change the world began in adulthood. And the peacemaker here, his mission to restore peace and unity began when he reached adulthood. The first person to accept and embrace the words of the Great Peace was a woman by the name of Jik On Sa-si. Her place was a neutral zone for anyone passing through, even war parties who would leave all of their weapons outside of her dwelling. She fed them and offered them a resting place. As he spoke his words, she broke down in tears, for she had never heard anything so beautiful, and said she would follow it for the rest of her days. Because she accepted and embraced the words of peace, the peacemaker told her that at the successful formation of the great law of peace, and for all time, she would be the symbol of leadership of the women, which is the clan mothers. And in this way, she would never be forgotten. There were women in Christ's ministry that were extremely important. The sisters of Lazarus, Mary Magdalene, and others. The peacemaker visited the Mohawks first. There he was to confront the most evil of them. He had to change their minds and behavior to accept the great peace. He was often tested and had to prove himself because the Kanikaka people were such a fierce and warring nation. The peacemaker worked very long and very hard to convince them to accept the great law of peace. And with his powers of persuasion, he won them over. He then left for the other nations of the Iroquois, the Seneca, the Oneidas, the Cayuga, and the Onondaga. The peacemaker met two special people who were instrumental in his establishment of the great peace. One of these men was Ayanwatha, whose family had been killed by the evil and powerful sorcerer Tadodaho, the other man. who typifies, I believe, Satan. He could typify Judas Iscariot, but he was the embodiment of evil that the peacemaker had to come up against. That this peacemaker sent from the Creator had to come up against. The peacemaker used the first condolence ceremony on Hiawatha to remove his grief using wampum shells. This event was the first time the wampum was ever used. Wampum is not used as money, as is popularly thought, or as Hollywood has showed us in the movies. However, wampum was used as an exchange tool. The peacemaker asked Hiawatha to be his spokesperson, and together they traveled to spread the message of peace. So he had at least one disciple. Well, two. He had, the Hiawatha who went with him. He had this woman who totally accepted his message, and so he did have disciples that were beginning to follow him. His travels brought him to the Onondaga Nation, where he met with a lot of resistance from the evil Tadodaho. Tadodaho was an evil man and is described as having snakes in his head and a crooked body. And this symbolized a very evil person, and because of his evil deeds, it reflected on him. Tadodaho would not give in to the many attempts by the peacemaker to get him to accept the peace. The peacemaker and Hiawatha moved on to the other nations and were successful in convincing them to accept the peace. He then gathered the 49 men whom he had convinced to accept the peace to converge back to the center, and there they all worked together on the evil mind of Tadodaho of the Onondaga Nation. They tried many times in many ways to convince him that peace was the only way, and many times they failed. And finally, all the 49 men sang the great song of peace, the Hiya, and the song kept in focus with the one purpose of winning over the evil mind of Tadodaho. And once Tadodaho's mind was pacified, his body straightened, and the snakes were combed from his hair. The evil loved him. Almost like he had been possessed by spirits, like the demonic that was in the graveyard, and Jesus cast the evil spirits out of him. It's almost like it's again a type of what happened in the New Testament. When he was pacified, his body, which was bent and ugly, straightened up. And can you imagine the snakes really living in his hair, and they were combed out of his hair? And the peacemaker offered him a special position in the confederacy. That position was to watch over the fire on behalf of all the 5 nations, and the offer appealed to him, and he accepted it. He agreed to live in peace and tend the fire to make sure that it would burn forever. After successfully winning over Tadodaho, the peacemaker then looked upon the men and saw that they still carried their weapons. He then said that they needed a symbol that would remind them of the promise made to each other, the promise of peace. And as he looked around, he saw this very tall tree. And he thought that because the tree was so tall, it could be seen from distant places, and because the top of the tree pierced the sky, attention would be drawn to it. And on the branches of this very tall tree, the needles are in clusters of 5, which would represent the 5 nations of the confederacy. He took some of the needles off one of the branches and told them that even with the changes of the season, the tree stays green for all time. So shall the great peace stay among the 5 nations for all time. You see, in this next part, the peacemaker has a command of nature, just as Jesus had a command of nature. Again, I'm not saying that it's Jesus. I'm just saying that in this legend, this mythology, he had a command of nature also. Because he then uprooted the tree, and it created a cavity. He instructed the men to cast down their weapons of war into the cavity and to bury their greed, hatred, and jealousy. The tree was then replaced by the peacemaker And then he said, into the depths of the earth, down into the deep under-earth currents of water, flowing into unknown regions, we cast all weapons of strife. We bury them from sight forever, and plant again the tree. Thus shall all great peace be established, and hostility shall no longer be known between the 5 nations, but only peace to the united people. So he plucked this incredibly huge tree from the ground. They cast their weapons of war into the cavity, and he replanted it, and it continued to grow. The roots that spread out from the tree are called the great white roots of peace, and they spread in the 4 directions, one to the north, one to the south, one to the east, and one to the west. And on top of this great tree was placed an eagle, and the meaning of planting the tree symbolizes great peace and great strength. And the eagle symbolizes keeping a watchful eye on the roots, and if any evil or danger approaches, he will scream loudly, sounding the alarm, and all the nations of the confederacy will at once come to the defense and rescue. This symbolizes that everyone has the responsibility to protect the peace. The Peacemaker then took an arrow from each one of the 5 nations and bound them together. By each nation contributing an arrow, it symbolized the combining of individual powers into one great power. The union had now been complete, a union which no one can bend or break. And the Peacemaker then said, We have now completed our power, so that we, the 5 nations confederacy, shall in the future have one body, one mind, and one heart. If any evil should befall us in the future, we shall stand or fall united as one man. Interesting legend with a lot of parallels, to the New Testament. One thing, when I first began to study as a Christian, as a newborn Christian back then, I asked a pastor, as a fundamental Baptist pastor, how the people, the Native Americans, were, because I believe that you're only saved by the shed blood of Jesus Christ. And if you haven't heard of him, how can you be saved? So I questioned to him, how were these people saved? And he said, the Native American people here were saved, judged by, we all have an inborn sense of good and evil. And that's true, we do. We know when we do wrong, it's wrong. We know when we do good, it's good. And that they would be judged by how they responded to the inner good or the inner evil. I don't know if that's how the people become saved, but I do know that it would not surprise me, because these people belonged as much to God as anybody else. These people were created by God as much as anyone else. And it wouldn't surprise me, knowing the loving God, knowing how loving God is towards his creation, especially towards man, that he could have quite conceivably sent a peacekeeper, whether it was Jesus or somebody else, to these people to teach them civilization. In the comments, please post your thoughts and ideas. I'd like to hear them. And thanks for stopping by.